The interpretation section, words and meaning. Why don't you agree? Do you wanna be free? Do you wanna be free?
Welcome to The Law is My Oyster. My name is Declan O'Lular QC, but you can call me Bebop. I am a barrister that Neil has briefed to explain a very important section that you find in all statutes and many other legal documents, the interpretation section. You will always find the interpretation section at or near the beginning of the Act. Most of the time the interpretation section is Section 2 of the Act, right after the long title and commencement details in Section 1. So let's get into it. Why is it so important to know about the interpretation section and know how to use it properly? First, it is important to know about and understand the principle of certainty. The principle of certainty in law demands that laws be clear, precise, and predictable, allowing individuals to understand the legal consequences of their actions and so plan their future, be that in business or on a personal level, with the knowledge that the law will not dramatically change overnight and so throw all those careful plans into a mess. In particular, the principle of certainty demands that laws have the following characteristics: clarity and precision. Laws should be written in clear and understandable language, so people can understand them and plan their futures, even with legal advice. Predictability. Individuals should be able to foresee the legal effects of their actions and decisions, protecting legitimate expectations. Stability and non-retroactivity. Laws should be stable, avoiding sudden, arbitrary changes, and generally not applied retroactively, in other words, with a backwards effect to disadvantage people. Accessibility. Sufficient public information must be available for people to know the law. Those are the ideals in any event. As we know, the laws passed by the legislature do not always live up to these criteria. The interpretation section is there to tell you how to use specific words in that particular statute. It is always at the beginning so that you know which words to look out for before you start to read the Act. The interpretation section often contains words that have a technical or specialized meaning. By technical we mean a word that is only used in certain sectors or disciplines and the average person would not have even heard of the word, let alone know what it means. So for example, in the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act 2015, the term greenhouse gas is defined to include hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, nitrogen trifluoride, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So while most of us have heard of the greenhouse effect and maybe even greenhouse gas, we would not have known the actual content of that gas unless we were a climate scientist. The interpretation section of that act then also defines all those different substances that make up greenhouse gas. This means that a person reading the Act who previously knew nothing about greenhouse gas would now know what is meant by the term greenhouse gas and what makes up that gas. Perhaps more importantly, because there are differing views about what greenhouse gas is and what makes it up, the reader knows when they read this Act that is what is meant by the term greenhouse gas. The reader does not have to agree with that definition, but for the purposes of that Act, that is what is meant by the term greenhouse gas. So there is certainty of meaning at least. The interpretation section contains words that have an extraordinary meaning. In many respects, these are the words that can create the most confusion as they are words that we know, but with different meanings to how we usually know them. A common example is the word functions. Ordinarily, a function means an activity that is natural toward the purpose of a person or thing, like bodily functions, or to function means to work or operate in a proper or particular way. However, the word functions in many acts is defined to mean to include not only roles, but powers and duties, a legal expansion of its ordinary meaning. This definition of functions is found in many different acts, including, for example, Child Care Act, 1991, Higher Education Authority Act, 1971, Gas Act, 1976, National Archives Act, 1986, and the Irish Film Board Act, 1980, to name a few. There are other words that often appear in acts but have an extraordinary meaning. If you see the word reasonable, it usually means that the thing must be looked at objectively, rather than subjectively. If you see the word must, this is what we call a mandatory, which means you have to do what the act tells you to do, and if you do not, you are probably breaking the law. On the other hand, the word may is what we would call discretionary, and it will allow you to choose whether to do something or not. What is most important to remember is that if a word is defined in the interpretation section, then when reading the act the reader must use that definition or interpretation, and only that interpretation. Good luck with that. Here is a definition of a motor vehicle from the Motor Vehicles, Registration of Importers, Act 1968, and it reads: Motor vehicle means, subject to subsection 2 of this section, a mechanically propelled vehicle which is complete or substantially complete and which derives its motive power from an internal combustion engine and is primarily designed, constructed and suitable for use on roads either for the carriage of goods or materials or persons or both goods or materials and persons or for the traction of a trailer or other vehicle, and includes a chassis or body which is complete or substantially complete and which is designed and constructed primarily for such a mechanically propelled vehicle, but does not include a vehicle having less than 4 wheels, a vehicle which is designed and constructed for the carriage of more than 16 persons, inclusive of the driver, whether with or without goods, an agricultural tractor or chassis or body which is complete or substantially complete and which is designed and constructed primarily for either of such vehicles or for such tractor. Phew, what a mouthful. What happened to clarity? And under that is an artificial intelligence visual interpretation of that definition. What do you think? Did the bot get it right? If a word appears in an act but is not defined in the interpretation section, it must be given its ordinary or everyday meaning. Sounds easy, but not so much. Picture this. If an alien which reproduces by simply duplicating itself asked you to explain what a child was, what would you say? Would everybody agree with you? How would the general population understand that word? Of course, in the old days when communities were close-knit and people did not travel much, there would be general agreement on the common vocabulary and meanings. However, in modern societies where you have a melting pot of nationalities, religions, beliefs and practices, it is sometimes quite difficult to identify a meaning for an ordinary word that everybody would agree with. So in the end it will be the court that decides the ordinary meaning of the word. So for example, in Minister for Education versus Synod, the Supreme Court had to decide the meaning of the word child as it appears in the Constitution. The Constitution deliberately does not have an interpretation section, and so the Supreme Court had to decide how the ordinary person would define child. The Supreme Court opted for the definition of a child as a person under the age of 18 years, which is the same as most statutory definitions of a child. See the Child Care Act, for example. However, it is also how a lot of ordinary people would define a child. So, I hope this little video has helped you understand the function of the interpretation section in an act, so that you can use it properly the next time you read a statute. My name is Declan O'Lula, and I'll see you soon on The Law is My Oyster.